Good evening, Grace Church. This is Dr. Dave coming at you on a fine Wednesday evening. I had some technical difficulties tonight, but I think we're getting started more or less on time. I trust we're all having a really good week this week. So far, we're halfway through, so hang in there. We're almost there. It occurred to me that because of the technical sacrifices we're having to make with all this, that I wasn't able to start my last Wednesday evening with the requisite humor presentation that I'm sure you guys were crying about missing. So we'll see if we can pull this off tonight without the benefit of PowerPoint pictures. So I thought tonight we would talk about horrible bosses. I'm sure some of you have had some horrible bosses over the years. I had a horrible boss in college when I worked at McDonald's. I'll never forget. Her name was Marguerite, and she was horrible to work for. Nothing that she ever did wrong was her fault, and everything that happened bad was everyone else's fault, and nothing that ever went right was anyone's fault but hers. But then suddenly at 10:30 every night, like clockwork, she became a real person and actually laughed and had fun, and we always looked forward to working those late shifts with her. So it was just a really weird situation. So we're going to talk about some bosses, some bad bosses. Maybe some of you recognize these guys or gals. That boss where you show up and they talk about having this warm, close-knit, family-type environment, and you start to refer to your boss by his first name, and they say, that would be Mr. So close-knit family as long as he's the boss and in charge. But then you've got that boss that he's giving you these big bunch of projects to work on, and you're working on it, you're doing great, and he walks into your office about 3:30 in the afternoon and said, I see you're working hard on those projects I gave you. You're doing great. Here, I'm giving you a bunch more work to do. See you later. I've got to go home. And then you've got that boss that sees you there working hard and says, I'd love to let you leave early, but I just thought of 20 completely random and meaningless tasks to give you to do right now. I've had a couple of bosses like that. Then there's the boss that walks up to your desk. Wow, it sure is a gorgeous day outside, isn't it? Boy, it would really be a good night to go to the park, wouldn't it? Oh, by the way, we're having a meeting tonight at 5. And then there's the boss that, you guys are looking at a problem that happened and something went horribly wrong. And the boss just looks at you and says, one of us is wrong, and I'm the boss, so it's not me. Those are wonderful bosses to work for. Then you've got the boss that says, we really value independence in our employees, and we want you to spread your wings and fly and do whatever it is that you're able to do to make this company better. But just know that we're going to be looking over your shoulder all the time and ask you to justify everything that you're doing and tell us why it is that you're doing everything that you're doing so that we can explain to you why what you did was wrong. But we want you to be independent and think your own thoughts and do your own thing. And then you get the boss that drives up in the new sports car, and you're like, wow, this is awesome. He's like, yeah, thanks. And if you work hard and put in your hours and do really good, then I'll get a new one next year. Which is almost as fun as the boss that is, walking through and apologizing to everyone because there's just no money for bonuses this year because it's been a tough year and we've done well, but there just wasn't quite enough there. And then next week you hear him bragging about the new bonus that he was able to get for himself. Then there's that boss that recognizes that you're valuable and recognizes that you've been in this position for a long time. And boy, we'd really love to give you a promotion and more responsibility. We have no doubt that you're capable of it. The problem is we just wouldn't be able to find anyone to replace you. So, sorry. And then you've got that boss. Sarah Wright knows exactly what I'm talking about. Where you're laid up in the hospital, you've been hit by a bus, you've got tubes and and wires and stuff coming out from everywhere, and the boss comes in and says, you're going to be at work tomorrow, right? Ask Sarah about doing the books from the hospital bed with pneumonia. It's a funny story. So tonight, we're not talking about bad bosses. We're going to spend a little more time talking about names of God. The last time we talked about names of God, we talked about the name Jehovah Jireh. We talked about, Jehovah Jireh. Traditionally, we think of as the God who provides. And it has that connotation, but really it's the God who sees and provides. And so we unpack that. Actually spent a couple of sermons unpacking that. And then there's other names that the Bible uses. El Shaddai. Many people remember the famous Amy Grant song from about 3 billion years ago. El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. El Olam, which means God Eternal. Yahweh, which we've talked about before, is kind of God's George, the holy name of God. When God met Moses at the burning bush, and Moses said, you want me to go to Egypt and tell the Israelites about you, and they know about 6.5 dozen gods there, so which God are you? And God says, I am that I am. And so that's known as the personal name of God, the holy name of God, or as I like to call it, God's George. You got Jehovah Rapha, God our healer. There's actually been a few counseling ministries that have taken on some form of that name. But then there's the name that we're going to talk about tonight, which is one that many of us might not be familiar with, Jehovah Nissi. Jehovah Nissi, which means God is our banner. And it's found in only one passage in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, in chapter 17. So if you want to take a second and flip there. Exodus chapter 17, starting in verse 8. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. And, if you're familiar with the history in this time period, then you know that this means that it was Thursday, because it seems like the Amalekites were attacking Israel about every Thursday. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow, if I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. And as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took up a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under the earth. And Moses built an altar and called it, the Lord is my banner. In the King James, it very often just says Jehovah Nissi. And so, basically, the Israelites once again were sat upon by the enemy, and God once again comes in and miraculously saves them. But then there's this name. God is our banner. And it's kind of an interesting sounding name today, because we really don't think like this anymore. We don't talk about banners and poles and standards and flags, or we have our national flag and things like that, but we really don't make a big deal out of this business of standards and flags and stuff. Excuse me. And so this formal name occurs really just once. God is our banner, and it occurs once in the story. But the other half of this name, Jehovah Nissi, actually occurs in many places throughout Scripture. And so Let's take a little tour of some of these places. So in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 5, and Isaiah is actually a book where this word Nisi appears a lot. And so Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 26. And here, this is God talking about future victory for Israel, how he's going to rescue Israel. And in chapter 26, it says, he lifts up a banner for the distant nations. He whistles for those at the end of the earth. Here they come swiftly and speedily. So God's banner is drawing Israel from the distant nations, scattered Israel from the distant nations. A part of the implication here is that God is drawing them back to their homeland. He's drawing them back to Himself. He's drawing them back to salvation. And this is a theme throughout Israel, throughout the book of Isaiah, of Israel being gathered up by God and ultimately being rescued and saved. And then in Jeremiah, we see this pop up again, starting in chapter 50, starting in verse 1. This is the word the Lord spoke through Jeremiah the prophet concerning Babylon in the land of the Babylonians. Announce and proclaim among the nations, lift up a banner and proclaim it. Keep nothing back, but say, Babylon will be captured. Bel will be put to shame. Marduk filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame. Her idols filled with terror. And it goes on. And so this is an oracle that Jeremiah gives about the destruction of Babylon that is going to come. And it begins with this announcement, this proclamation, this lifting a banner, or if you will, waving a flag. Basically a monument talking about this announcement, this thing that is to come. But then in the New Testament, we have sort of an allusion to this. In John chapter 3, as many of us will remember, is Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. And he recognized that Jesus was a teacher sent by God. He at this point in the conversation, he wasn't sure that Jesus was the Messiah, but he definitely knew that Jesus was a man of God, a man who taught for God, spoke for God. And so he was coming to him and wanting to know, I wanted to ask some more questions of him, and he asked him about this whole business of they get on this topic of being born again, of being saved. And then in verse 14, we'll just start in verse 10. Nicodemus is asking him these questions about being born again and how is this supposed to happen. You are Israel's teacher, said Jesus, and you do not understand these things? I tell you the truth, we speak of what we know, and we testify of what we have seen, but still you people do not accept our testimony. I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. So this is John 3, verse 14 and 15. And so it's this idea that just as Moses, so Jesus tells them, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Well, that seems like an odd thing to say. What does exactly that mean? Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, and what does that have to do with the topic tonight? Let's flip back to the book of Numbers. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So the fourth of the 5 books of Moses. In chapter 21, and beginning in verse 4, there's this interesting story. Some of us have heard the story before. This is during the Exodus. They were traveling through the desert, and they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. The Edomites, you might remember, were descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. And Jacob and Esau personally did not have particularly good relations, and Israel and Edom did not typically have very good relations. And so they wanted to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way, and they spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. And then when anyone was bitten by the snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. So this is actually a really odd story. And the oddness might not be obvious at first. The second commandment specifically prohibits the making of graven images. And in technical language, what that means is any sort of an engraved image that would be worshipped as an idol. But throughout Scripture, it makes it very clear that it doesn't matter if it's an engraved image or a cast image or a molded image or a painted image or whatever. The idea is a prohibition against any sort of image that might be used as an object of worship. And people have taken this to various extremes. There are Christian groups that don't allow dolls to have faces because in their view that's a form of a graven image and not a good thing. But it's this whole idea of this prohibition against making images of things that then might end up turning around to be worshipped. And yet here in this story, God commands Moses, "I want you to make an image of this snake. And I want you to make a bronze snake, and I want you to put it on this pole." And then when the people were bitten by these fiery serpents, as the story in older versions, King James and other older versions call it, then they would look at this bronze snake and be healed. The next time we hear about this bronze snake is actually in 2 Kings chapter 18. There's a new king in town, and this king is actually honoring God and worshiping God. And so he's going through and tearing down idols and tearing down high places and chopping down Asherah poles and stuff. And this bronze snake has been with Israel this whole time, and people have been burning incense to this snake. And so he takes it and breaks it apart and destroys it so that people won't do that. So this image that God commanded the people to make eventually does become an object of worship that leads people astray. So it's really an odd story because God asked them to do something that seems rather contradictory to one of the things that he told them not to do. But then it really brings about an interesting question of what was this fiery serpent? And there's actually been a lot of debate about this over the years among scientists. Because you see, scientists aren't regular people. And I'm including myself in this. We're not regular people. A regular person just reads this and says, yeah, there's some snakes and they bit people and they got sick and they were going to die and God saved them. And they just move on and they're okay with that. And it's fine that you're okay with that. Some of us are just weird. And so we got to know, what kind of snake was this? Was it a copperhead? Was it a cottonmouth? Well, it wasn't a cottonmouth because they were in the desert. What kind of idiot are you? Was it a rattlesnake? Well, maybe there's rattlesnakes over there. Was it some other kind of poisonous snake? And then you've got the really strange guy, the parasite guy that says, well, there's this worm that's found in that part of the world called the guinea worm. You guys can Google this, but do it before you eat dinner. And the guinea worm is this funny little parasite that when you drink contaminated water, you drink in these eggs, and it goes into your body. And the eggs hatch in your gut, and then the worms burrow out of your gut into your bloodstream, and then they burrow into these little teeny tiny veins, typically in your leg and down into your foot. And then when you put your foot in the water, then the snake makes this little blister, the worm makes this little blister, and sticks its egg depositor out, and it lays eggs in the water. And that's how it completes its life cycle. And they've called this thing the fiery serpent for a long time. One, because apparently when it's making this hole to stick out of your foot, it burns like fire. And two, these are huge worms. I mean, they can be, a couple of feet long or more. The other thing that's fascinating about this worm in relation to this story is it has to be removed from the body in a very specific sort of a way. It sticks its thing out, it sticks its little end out, and you would think that you just kind of grab the end and just kind of pull on it and pull it out. The problem is if you pull on it too hard, the snake breaks open, and then your body has this powerful immune response to the insides of the snake, such that it could kill you. It's an extremely dangerous sort of a situation. And so what they have found out over the years is the safest way to remove the snake is when you have someone put their foot in the water and get the end of the snake, the worm to come out, and then you grab it gently and you tie it around a stick. And then you slowly wind it around this stick. So you wind it a few turns and then kind of tape the stick to your foot and then come back later and wind it a few more turns. And you do this over, several hours. And eventually you get the worm out, the worm doesn't break, and you're better. Interestingly enough, I believe this has been the focus of much of President Carter's clean water projects around the Middle East is providing clean water supply specifically because of this parasite. So if we take this story of this worm, this fiery serpent, and we stick it back into the story, believe it or not, it actually helps the story to make more sense. And let me explain why. If this snake, this fiery serpent that the Bible talks about, is just a snake, then this bronze serpent on a pole actually becomes a magical device, which the Bible expressly prohibits. Because look at this snake and you'll be healed. Well, nowhere in the Bible does God ever command you to look to an object for healing. God says if you want to be healed, you come to me for healing, and I'll heal you. Nowhere does the Bible say, go here and do that. Now, there are some times that the Bible asks you to do things related to objects. Naaman, the leper, went to Elijah to be healed because he heard that Elijah was a healer. And Elijah said, go down to the river Jordan and bathe yourself 7 times and you'll be healed. And Naaman was like, river, that's just a nasty river. We've got much better rivers than that back home. And eventually he acquiesced and he went down and bathed in the river and was healed. But that action didn't make that river a magical object. That was just simply God telling them to do something, and he did it, and he was healed. This notion that the snake, the bronze snake, you looked at the bronze snake and you were healed, makes that a magical object. It suggests that snake somehow had magical powers to be able to heal you if that's what was going on. But if you think back to the guinea worm and wrapping this worm around a stick and slowly removing it from the body, what has been suggested is that that's exactly what Moses did, is he made this bronze snake and he wrapped it around this pole and stuck it up there as a reminder to people, this is how you fix this. When you think about this in terms of the history of medicine, it's actually kind of amazing. Hippocrates, who's kind of considered the father of all medicine, was an ancient Greek philosopher, and so he would have been possibly 1,000 years or more after Moses. So there really wasn't anyone thinking about modern medicine or anything approximating medicine at the time. Most of the things that you hear about in the Old Testament when they talk about a particular disease, they're using very generic terms. They talk about leprosy in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and most of the, this includes groups of diseases, just basically skin diseases and rashes and stuff that have nothing to do with what we consider the modern disease of leprosy. Certainly there were people that had that, but you look at some of the different ways that they would cure people of leprosy, and that bears very little resemblance to today's concept of leprosy. And a lot of this just goes back to when they were translating the Bible into English for the first time in the 16th and 17th centuries. They had no idea what some of these words were that were talking about specific diseases, and they took their best guess. Well, this is a bad skin disease, and it makes them unclean, so it must be leprosy, because lepers are unclean. There you go. And so in terms of, and then, there's other interesting things in the Bible where the Bible is listing different kinds of critters and putting them into different categories. There's at least one place in the Bible where they're making a list of birds, and bats are included in a list of birds. And we know that bats aren't birds. At that day and age, they didn't necessarily differentiate between birds and mammals, and for the purposes of that situation, it didn't really matter. So here we have this fiery serpent, which is a local colloquial term for this parasite that, as far as we know, goes back thousands of years. And here, long before there would have been a good understanding of modern medicine and modern medical treatment, here we have God providing to Moses, in a miraculous way, because God spoke to Moses, a way to deal with this problem. You get bit by the fiery serpent. If you don't treat it correctly, you die. So here's what you do so that you don't die. Now, if you think about it from that perspective, rather than this bronze snake being a magical object that you just look at and hocus pocus, you're healed, it actually becomes a miraculous provision that God gave Moses for Israel's healing. Here's this thing. There's no possible way that you can know how to deal with this thing. So I'm going to give you knowledge of how to deal with this. There you go. Now go save your people. And of course, that's not without precedent. When they built the tabernacle, God miraculously gave people abilities they didn't have to complete the task to build the tabernacle, and with the temple and other places in the Bible. And so this would also fit John's illustration even more, right? John just said, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. So Moses took this snake and put it on a pole, lifted it up in the wilderness to show this is how you are healed from this problem. Jesus is lifted up on the cross to show us how we are healed from sin. With the fiery serpent in the Old Testament, we're healed from sin by following this procedure, and we get the snake out and we don't die. With following Jesus, we don't follow a procedure, but we die to ourselves, and we follow God no matter the cost, no matter the end. And so here we have Jesus laying down his life, but also through this illustration that Nicodemus would have understood, he's saying this the same way that Moses saved his people with the fiery serpent, I am saving my people through me, being lifted up on a pole and showing the way to salvation. And so when you bring this back around full circle to Jehovah Nissi, we have the Lord, Jehovah, the Eternal One, the one who is, was, and forever will be, is the one who challenges us to seek victory. Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is our banner. It also means the Lord is our victory. The word Nissi is very much like a Hebrew version of the Greek word Nike. Some of you recognize that Nike was the ancient Greek god of victory, which is why that's what the shoes are called. So Jehovah Nissi, God is our victory. So God, Jehovah, is the one who challenges us to seek victory, points us to victory, destroys our enemies, and provides us with victory. But here's the question. What kind of victory does he provide? And what if he doesn't provide the sort of victory that we are anticipating or expecting? Which kind of leads me to my last little bit here. I want to, by way of illustration, talk for a moment about the 12 spies. You remember in Numbers chapter 13, they're coming up to the promised land, they're scoping it out, and Moses sends 12 spies into the promised land, one from each tribe. And they spend time in Canaan, scouting it out, trying to find out what this land has to offer. And they come back, and 10 spies bring back this dismal, fearful, unencouraging report. Yes, the land flows with milk and honey. It's awesome. It's amazing. But oh my goodness, there's giants there. Big giants. They live in fortified cities. It's horrible. It's terrible. There's no way we could ever do this. And then 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, brought back these encouraging reports. They said, yeah, there's the land indeed flows with milk and honey. It's indeed amazing. And yeah, there's giants there. And yeah, there's fortified cities there. But we can do it. There's no way we can not do this. It's amazing. So there's 2 different perspectives that are being shared. And the reports are coming from 2 different perspectives. See, the spies, the 10 spies, were looking at this situation from a human perspective. The people out there were giants. There's lots of them. They live in fortified cities. See, these 10 spies, thinking from a human perspective, were looking for a military victory. And all they saw was the strength of their enemies. They looked at these giants and these fortified cities, and they turned around and looked at their comrades in arms in Israel, and they're like, ain't no way. We're like Boy Scout Troop 12 going up against the 1st Marine Regiment. Not going to happen. Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, were looking at the situation from God's perspective. God has brought us out of Egypt, the 10 plagues, across the Red Sea. He's brought us through the wilderness. He's provided for us manna and quail and all these different things. So surely he's going to get us through this. They saw the situation from God's perspective. They were looking for God's victory. They saw his strength. And from that, they concluded that their victory was assured. So as we're sitting in the middle of this current mess, are we looking at our situation from a human perspective or from God's perspective? Are we looking for a political solution? A lot of people are talking about that right now. Make America great again. Keep America great. Oh no, we need a politician that's going to give us lots of money, lots of goodies. We're looking for a political solution. Are we expecting the government to save our lives? There's another COVID stimulus fund going on. Maybe that'll be it. That'll save us. That'll make the day. Are we basing our hope on our estimation of the skills of our political leaders? You know, our governor is a genius or an idiot. Our president is this or that. Our officials are this or that. Is that what we're basing our hope on? Or are we looking at our situation from God's perspective? The fact that he's Jehovah Nissi, God our banner, God our victory. Because see, we ought to be looking at this from the standpoint of his strength, not the strength of our government, from his resources, not the resources of our politicians, to realize, and when we do that, we realize very quickly that our victory is assured, that we're going to come through this fine. In point of fact, our nation has been through bigger scrapes than this. Even in my lifetime, this nation has been through bigger scrapes than this. And it really comes down to, what are we looking for? Are we looking for a political solution, or are we looking for a divine solution? It was the same thing in Jesus' day, right? You had these people that were looking for a political Messiah, including some of his own disciples. James and John. When you come into your kingdom, we want to sit on your right and your left. And they're standing there in the book of Acts as Jesus is about to ascend into heaven. Then one of the disciples says, "Now are you going to establish Israel and return the kingdom to Israel?" And you just kind of hear this guttural sigh coming from Jesus. Just hang out for a while, it'll all make sense. Or are we looking for, rather than a political solution, are we looking for God's solution? Are we looking for a spiritual solution through a relationship with him? Because at the end of the day, a political solution is fine as long as you like the politician. But if you don't like the politician, it tends to not matter what the solution is. But God's solutions tend to work no matter who's in charge, as long as he's the one in charge. Whatever government is in charge. God's solutions worked fine for first century Christians when Nero was in charge. And people even worse than Nero. God's solutions work in other parts of the world today, where they're being persecuted by their government, being persecuted by members of other religious groups. And works today in our nation, where people are being persecuted for their faith more and more. And so that's what I want to leave us with, is what is our perspective in this current situation? Are we dependent on the government? Are we dependent on politics? Are we dependent on our political leaders? Or are we dependent on God? Are we looking to him as our strength, as our solution, as the one that's going to get us through this and get us safely on the other side? So I don't have all the fancy technology that Travis has, because he's a pastor and I'm not but a humble country doctor. But do want to remind you guys that we need to continue to be faithful in our giving. I'm not going to even pretend to be as clever as Jay, but I would remind us that we're going to be having services again on Wednesday. I believe the times are 8:30, 10, and 11:30. So come ready to mingle outside, not inside. Come ready to douse yourself in hand sanitizer. We'll be sitting in family groups with reduced numbers of chairs for social distancing. And let's come prepared to worship God in the midst of all this nonsense. So hope you guys have been encouraged tonight, and let's see you guys all on Sunday.